Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. Today on IGPP Expert Talks, we are joined by a dear friend, Mr. Kallol Bhattacherjee, whose recent book, Nehru's First Recruits, The Diplomats Who Built Independent India's Foreign Policy, has recently been released. Mr. Kallol Bhattacherjee is the Senior Assistant Editor, Foreign Affairs, with India's leading newspaper, The Hindu. He has previously authored The Great Game in Afghanistan, Rajiv Gandhi, General Zia, and the Unending War. Welcome to IGP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Heena.
So, your congratulations on your book, Nehru's First Recruits. I
Thank you.
want to begin with an overview of Nehru's foreign policy, and
Right.
there is a school which would say that Nehru's foreign policy, with its principles of non-alignment, was sort of idealistic, and there are others who would say that no, he was ultimately a realist. Emerging from the shadows of the colonial rule, dealing with problems like food insufficiency and not having any industry manufacturing to its name, how idealist could India really afford to be? And how would you view the early years of Nehru's foreign policy?
Well, thank you so much, Hinaji, and of course, I'm grateful to IGPP for giving me the platform to talk about Nehru's First Recruits. This is, of course, my second book, but this is a very special book because it's probably had been under the works for more than a decade now, and I've been working on it off and on, and of course, the process was also disrupted by the pandemic, during which research was very difficult. But to come back to your question on idealism and realism regarding Nehru, I would say that when we evaluate a particular phase in history, it's perhaps best to look at the objective realities that we are talking about. And the objective realities that the Nehru era was dealing with, especially in 1946 and 1947, were really absolutely exceptional because India had never faced the challenges from so many fronts as India faced in that particular duration of time. To begin with, India emerged from the Second World War. The year 1945 is when all the nationalist leaders were set free. They came out of prison. The anger and the street level rage over Quit India movement was very much there. The country was very angry over the fact that India was pushed into the Second World War against the wishes of the people, and so many Indian men died in the Second World War in distant parts of the world. And then we had the terrible thing in India called the famines that happened. Now, the biggest of the famines, of course, was the Bengal famine, as we know, but then there were also smaller famines that happened across the country. There was a famine in the southern part of India. There were other famines like in Orissa as well as in Bihar. And what happened was that across the country there was this shadow of scarcity of food. And the biggest reality in life is really the reality of hunger that India was staring at. And I would say that when the Nehruvian state took charge of the Indian post-colonial Indian state in 1946 as during the interim government, and in 1947 when India finally became independent, the biggest challenge that India faced at that time was really the scarcity of food. And that is why in my book I have written about the contribution of the likes of Poonamale Ramakrishna S. Mani, who is known as PRS Mani, Jawaharlal Nehru. The two of them, most importantly, were the creators of food diplomacy in India. So when I look at Nehru's food diplomacy, especially when it happened in the backdrop of India's freedom struggle, because India was yet to emerge as a free country, and the way that coin was used to deal with the providers of food from abroad, especially a country like, say, Indonesia. I would say it was really a very, very realist and very intelligent way of doing business at the diplomatic level, in which India gave Indonesia the recognition that it wanted, and in return, Indonesia gave India the food that it very badly required. India also gave Indonesia textile items. But what happened was India did not have the required food because India's entire food supply chain had been disrupted by the war, by the famine, and then very frankly speaking, everyone knows what the reason for the disruption of the food supply chain was. That the entire food supply of India and also from neighboring countries was pushed into the war effort that was being led by the allied countries. So there was the reality that India had to somehow procure food. And food is a strategic commodity, just like energy and technology. To procure food is a very, very difficult thing. I mean, either you grow it at home or you get it from friendly countries. So, but even friends don't part with food very easily because after all, they have to feed themselves first. So in that condition, it was Indonesia who became the first food exporter to India. So Nehru's diplomacy, therefore, I would say, begins from the very realist foundation of how to ensure food security for India. I mean, there are occasions when Nehru was obviously idealistic, when he talks about, say, one world, which these days we describe as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But then Nehru talked about one world also. I mean, that was one of the biggest pillars of his foreign policy. But at the same time, when it came to ensuring food security, he went all out. Indonesia was the first country with which food was used as a very interesting way to ensure that Indians would get food, Indonesians would get recognition, Indonesians would also get textile supply from India, and then India championed and campaigned for Indonesia's freedom. So, what India had at that time was a voice, because India's voice was very important, because India's freedom struggle over the last 40, 50 years had been known across the world, and India's freedom leaders were known for their being a very different high stature. So they were widely known across the world. So when they started talking about Indonesia's freedom, Indonesia's leaders also felt emboldened. They felt encouraged. So I think Nehru did diplomacy in a very realistic manner, because what is more real than food? So I would say yes, there were occasions when he was idealistic, but there were many occasions when Nehru was very, very realist.
A leader is nothing without his commanders, because then they would be the ones who are executing policies, right? So the early diplomats that we read about in your book were also infused with ideas of anti-colonialism, nationalism, liberation, and came from different backgrounds. Like, they were philosophers, they were journalists, they were
True.
poets. Did that also play an important role in shaping India's foreign policy?
Well, first of all, we also have to look at the mood that India was in. India was in a very angry state of mind. There was the whole feeling that India had been very badly let down by the colonial powers. Lots of Indians, as I just said, perished in very distant parts of the world. They fought for the Allied powers. Then the country was internally rocked by all sorts of radical politics. There was Quit India movement. It was very, very difficult to control insurrectionary movements, terrorism, insurgency, left-wing movements, including people like even Firoz Gandhi, who later on everyone got to know him as the husband of the future Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. They all were underground revolutionaries. They were they were basically into all sorts of insurgent methods to overthrow the colonial power. So in 1945, just to give an example, when Nehru came out of prison, one of the lingering fears that Indians had was that the British rule probably was not going to end so soon. Because what was happening was that the British rulers, they had won the Second World War with the help of, obviously, thousands of Indian lives. Indian soldiers fought for the British authority in the Second World War. But what happened as soon as the war ended was that all these Indian soldiers were being steered towards Indonesia. To do what? To crush the Indonesian freedom struggle. So there was this widespread anger in India that here the Allied powers were fighting Hitler's Germany under the flag of freedom, liberty, equality, and fraternity. They fought the Second World War to ensure freedom of the whole world. And as soon as they won that war in Europe, they turned their focus on Indonesia. Why? Because Indonesians were asking for the same thing as the British people wanted just a few months ago. Indonesians wanted freedom from the Dutch colonial control. But for this particular period, the British forces came around and they wanted to crush the Indonesians. And at that time, the country, especially the Indian press, the Indian media, Indian leaders, were absolutely disappointed by this particular display of neo-imperial attitude, that the British powers, or British power perhaps, is not going to leave the region. So if you look at the speeches of Nehru at that time, you find unprecedented kind of anger. Nehru was threatening the British colonial administration that if they did not quit not just India but Southeast Asia, then there is going to be a very wide-scale conflict, which is going to be of great, historic significance, and nevertheless going to be a huge tragedy for everyone involved. So in that condition, these values that you just mentioned, anti-colonial sentiment, nationalism, those were not just, ideals of some distant variety. Those were the ideals that young men and women were living on a daily basis. So when you look at these early recruits, when they were coming in with the idea that India is going to be decolonized. It meant not just that the end of the British colonial rule in India, but also the end of the French colonial enclaves, the Portuguese control in Goa, and all sorts of other colonial possessions, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, or even perhaps in the Indian Ocean region. All these must come to an end. So there was this great deal of impatience among the young people at that time. So when they came into the service, they also naturally brought in these values and these ideals into the service. So it is natural for them to bring in, and then the service also kind of reflected these values, because Nehru himself was, after all, a very proclaimed anti-imperial figure. His views were very well known, but the fact was that he was always very elegant in conveying these views, and I think that remained a hallmark of the first decade of Indian Foreign Service, that whatever rage and anger the young people and the young officers had at that time, they always articulated it in a very elegant manner.
How did India's game of diplomacy or the foreign services first begin? Because were there always examinations as we have them now, or were independent India's first diplomats borrowed from the colonial administration, or were they direct recruits from other spheres of life? What was it like?
Well, before 1949 January, what existed was basically the Department of Commonwealth Relations and External Affairs. But from 1949 onwards, the Commonwealth Relations was removed and the Ministry of External Affairs was basically coined, and that is what became the main ministry. But at that time, of course, from October 1946 onwards, when we had the interim government, which was basically a composite government consisting of many political parties, and it was, of course, a pre-partition government, which was led by the Viceroy and, of course, the Prime Minister, who was then not yet the former Prime Minister, that's Mr. Nehru himself. At that time, in October 1946, the cabinet decision was taken to establish the Indian Foreign Service. Then came more or less at the same time, the rules were set. What are the rules that were going to be in the Indian Foreign Service? And those rules were very much in line with the prevailing, colonial administrative structure. So the rules were pretty much like, as one would say, perhaps British rules. So there is one criticism for that particular period, which is often articulated by historian Indivar Kamtekar of JNU, who has used the term concealment of continuity. He says that the post-colonial state of India indulged in concealment of continuity, because in the way that the administration evolved after 1947, it actually imbibed a lot of colonial administrative attributes. But then to make it, to give credit to Nehru and also his colleagues, that despite the continuity, which they were obviously trying to conceal, as Indivar Kamtekar has said, and Indivar Kamtekar, by the way, is the son of Dilip Kamtekar, about whom I have written in my book. So, despite that attempt to conceal, there were a lot of new elements that they brought in. Now, one of the new element was that they decided that the Indian Foreign Service must reflect the personality of India. It must reflect the diversity that exists at the level of Indian human resource. So it begins with having the elite Indian civil service officers who are the veterans. Then it also went on to have university graduates as competition walas, as they were called. So you had these very young college graduates and university graduates like Maharaja Krishna Rasgotra, K. Natvar Singh, Jyotindranath Dikshit, Muttamma. They all came in as fresh young competition walas, and they came and they joined the service from 1948 onwards, 48, 49. Very small number of direct recruits, they were called. They were very special, and they were trained. How? They were trained by sending them to the West. They were sent to Cambridge and Oxford. So again, why were they sent to the Western universities, despite the fact that the biggest problem that India had in the previous century was actually rooted in the West? So one of the persons of the time, that's Mr. Rasgotra, told me that there was this pragmatic understanding in Nehru's administration that if we have to really learn how to run our country, then we have to really go back to the people who ran the administration over the last 100 years or so. So the young men and women were sent for training, and they were trained in these various Western capitals like London, Paris, Washington DC, and other capitals. But at the same time, there was also the veterans, because the machine had to be run, right? Because there were new crises erupting every day, from the United Nations to the Suez Canal crisis to Hungarian crisis. So all these major crises had to be handled, and those crises could be handled by very young people. So the veterans were also hired. So the veterans came, along with them came these a whole bunch of translators and interpreters who are not trained formally. They came with their skills that they had acquired earlier in various other walks of life. So there were these academics, historians, security experts, and very interestingly, people who fought against the colonial administration till a few years ago. They were now working side by side with the ICS officers. And remember, the ICS officers in many cases were the ones who were responsible for sending Indian freedom fighters to jail. And so this is also the beauty of the new system, that while you are bringing in the ICS officers, and as Indivar Kamtekar said, continuity was being maintained, at the same time they also brought in the rebels. And these rebels who fought the ICS officers till a few years ago were now working side by side. So I would say that along with the competition, along with these tests that were conducted by the UPSC, the United Public Service Commission, there were also these irregular recruits who came in. And the irregular recruits are the most amazing part of Nehru's first recruits, because they brought in with them the kings and the princes, divans, military officers, rebels, and a few oddballs, and also absolute spies. There was a man called A.C. Nambiar who served with Subhash Chandra Bose in Germany. He was some sort of a spy kind of a figure who worked for Nehru when he was a freedom fighter, and then he became India's second ambassador to Germany. So A.C. Nambiar. So there were lots of these interesting characters, and who can forget Amitabh Bachchan's, the mega star. His father, Harivansh Rai Bachchan, himself was an IFSB recruit. He was a poet of great eminence and fame, and he was, after all, a special service special officer on special duty in South Block. And so these are like legendary figures, and the mix was therefore very interesting. It was never free of criticism, but then I feel that there was a progressive focus that they maintained. So they came through exams, they came through recommendations, and they came, most importantly, through Nehru, because Nehru would be meeting these new recruits before they were hired.
Your book draws its inspiration from a booklet, The History of Service Lists,
Exactly,
published by Ministry of External Affairs. Tell us a little about that and how were you able to locate it?
So I always had this focus that I must find out what really makes this service very special. And when I started reading into the service and its roots and origins, I felt that it was actually the brainchild of the first prime minister, of course, and also the prime minister's very close colleagues like Secretary General Vijay Shankar Bajpayee, the first foreign secretary, KPS Menon, and the protege of Mr. Bajpayee at that time, Subimal Dutt, and few others like that. And I felt that a service which is so privileged from because it was nurtured as a brand new service, because we didn't have Indian Foreign Service before 1946 October, or say even 1947 and 1948. So my curiosity was pretty organic as a reporter and a researcher and a student of foreign policy and foreign affairs. And I often used to interact with these diplomats and the veteran diplomats. And one of the persons I have been in constant touch is Mr. K. Natwar Singh, who, of course, as we all know, was the External Affairs Minister in 2005, 2004 and 5. And then before that, he was, of course, the Minister of State for External Affairs in the 1980s. And I often, even now, I often talk to him on phone. And whenever I talk to him about his career, he always has very meticulous details. So if he has to talk about a colleague of with whom he might have worked, he always gave me a great deal of details. I always used to wonder that how does Mr. Natwar Singh, continue to remember so many details, and always, he always has this very fascinating and elephantine memory. And one day we were talking about this gentleman called an ICS officer of that time called Mr. VMM Nair. And as we were discussing Mr. Nair's career, Mr. Natwar Singh recounted Mr. Nair's, postings in, as usual, in great detail. Then I asked him that, Mr. Singh, how do you remember so many details? And he promptly said, "Oh, that's because I'm looking at my official directory." I said, "When was this directory published?" He said, "Oh, it was published in 1959. And I said that I would like to see the directory. He said, "Yeah, you should see the directory because it is the first directory of the Indian Foreign Service." So that is how in the history of services of 1959 was introduced to me. And when I went to see the directory, Mr. Singh gave me the directory, and I opened the directory and I found the first names were of the people who were born in the 19th century. So, and then as you turn the pages, I found there were people who were born in the 1930s or late 1920s. So I felt this is a very fascinating book, because if you juxtapose the careers of these officers side by side, then you basically have more or less a century of foreign affairs from 1919 to say 2010 and 11, when Chinmaya Garekhan, one of the first recruits, was still in service of the government of India under the prime ministership of Dr. Manmohan Singh. It struck me that this is a book which has a narrative hidden inside. So I asked Mr. Singh, I said, I would like to take the book. And he very kindly said, "Okay, I could take it." And I started my research right from that point, in a more focused manner, I would say. Yeah.
This book sheds light on many aspects of Prime Minister Nehru, his secularism, his idealism, his realism, but it also brings into focus a very traditional side of him, and that relates to women in foreign services, that female officers could not marry, and if they did, they would have to resign from the services. What do you make of it? Nehru's life has been full of very strong, notable female personalities, not only in his person but also professional life. Why would he espouse such a rule then?
Well, Nehru was the creation of his time, and he was also influenced by many of the traditions and many innovations and certain practices that also took that more or less became part of life in the 1930s and 40s. And one of the things that we saw during the Second World War was that women were assigned certain gender roles, stereotypical gender roles, like they were asked not to marry if they had to work in, say, post and telegraph, because there was obviously a shortage of men, because men were basically sent to fight. So young educated women were often hired or employed in certain sectors where the responsibility would be 24/7. So, for example, nursing as one part, one profession, then post and telegraph, communication in general. Those were the areas where young women were employed, even in the Western countries. You can see in actually Hollywood films, you will often see that. Yeah, I think in Pearl Harbor, one recent film where we see young women are working in post and telegraph offices till late night. And one of the reasons they were hired was that they were hired on condition of no marriage. So I think that was one practice which lingered as India also became independent, because during the transition from say 1945, 46 to 47, many of these Second World War wartime practices which also were prevalent in India, as India was really a big center of war effort. Some of these practices also lingered on, and they seeped into the administrative services. So these early biases that we see, that the young women were not allowed to, were asked not to marry if they were to get into Indian Foreign Service. To me, it appears it was kind of a continuation of the gender bias that we saw during the Second World War. But then there was also these individual biases that we also got to see when Prime Minister Nehru was interviewing, for example, Mira Ishadas Malik, when he said that why do you want to go to China? You should be opting for London, because it is a far more comfortable place for a young lady like you. And China is so backward. Obviously, China was not as comfortable perhaps for a young lady as it is today. But then that was Nehru as well. So I feel Nehru also Nehru was complex. Nehru was not always progressive. I mean, there are occasions when he talks about his own daughter. In fact, Indira Gandhi had a very difficult marriage, as we all know. And there comes an occasion when he is perhaps talking to one of his nieces or one of his relations. And he said, in context to his daughter's marital life, then he said that you should seek a very clear position in your marriage, because don't be like my daughter, who is neither married nor divorced. And that's something like, Nehru talking about it in this manner was quite surprising, even for me as a reader, when Nehru talked about his own daughter, because as a father, perhaps he wanted his daughter to be perhaps like as usual, an Indian father, perhaps happily married forever. But then there are ups and downs of life that as we human beings perhaps they were facing. So I feel there is a modern side of Nehru when we see the state building activities by him that we see that is most prominent for us even today. But there are occasions, there are flashes of traditional Nehru that also is apparent when we delve little deep into his personality. It may not be the most talked about part of Nehru's personality, but we know that existed. I mean, he these things we can actually go on and on about, because he comes, after all, from his mother was very traditional. His father was very different from his mother. So his mother, they came from the Kashmiri background. His father was influenced by the Western values, and he traveled across the world, took them to travel across the world. But his mother was very much, I think Motilal Nehru himself said, very delicate and very tradition bound. So that influence perhaps was somewhere in the core of Nehru's personality, and that also perhaps influenced some of his choices and interactions that we see in the first recruits.
You also make mention in your book about a certain infamous press conference in Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, which led to the then Foreign Secretary A.P. Venkateshwaram losing his job. What happened? Tell us a little about that conference, because we do find the mention, but you don't elaborate upon it. And what does happen when diplomats are not in alignment with the views of the government? Uh, does that happen now as well?
Well, A.P. Venkateshwaran came from a very illustrious background. His father was also an ICS officer, and then he was the 1952 batch IFS officer. In fact, he was, if I'm right, the contemporary of Dilip Kamtekar. So what happened was that when he joined the Indian Foreign Service, the future Prime Minister of India, that is Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, was perhaps 7 years old and was a little boy in his grandfather's house in Timuti Bhavan. So when AP Venkateswaran became the foreign secretary in early 1980s, that is 86, 87, there were a lot of these occasions when his colleagues saw that he was being a little casual in his interaction with the Prime Minister. In 1985, when Rajiv Gandhi became the Prime Minister, he had a really huge mandate. He had 413 Lok Sabha MPs with him. So therefore, some people would always advise him that you should be a little cautious when you talk to such a powerful Prime Minister, because not even Mr. Nehru had that sort of mandate. But AP Venkateswaran was known for his ready wit. He was he's an erudite, extremely well-traveled person. He had interacted with many, many world leaders during the past 3.5 decades of his service. And he perhaps was confident of his personality and the force of his character. But the early 1980s were also a period of great tension in India, because we had terrorism and insurgency in different parts of the country. Relation with Pakistan was deeply fraught with all sorts of danger. Pakistan was moving ahead with a nuclear weapons program that India wanted to stop. And it was actually a press conference in which the Pakistan issue was raised by one of the reporters. And Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had said something, and it was previously contradicted by the foreign secretary. So when he was basically confronted with that, he promptly responded saying that from tomorrow you will find a new foreign secretary. And there ended the career of AP Venkateswaran. So it was kind of a mutiny-like situation inside the foreign service at that time, because a lot of the people in the Indian foreign service thought of Mr. Venkateswaran as really a father figure, because he was known. He was quite charismatic. He was well-spoken. And, he had a great following in the service. And remember that AP Venkateswaran was more or less the third or the fourth, third. Direct recruits, because the direct recruits became the Indian foreign secretary with Mr. Maharaja Krishna Rasgotra, who basically came from 1980 onwards, when after Jagat Singh Mehta and Ram Sathai. These are the last of the people who are from the ICS and the Indian military service and etc., who were hired in the first wave. And so now we had the first direct competition walas becoming foreign secretary. So it was a matter of great pride that these are the boys and girls who had been trained at home, and it's a good thing that now they are taking charge. And so the way Mr. A.P. Venkateswaran was dismissed by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was really a sad day for the entire service, and his career more or less ended there. But then he continued in very different ways. He was a prominent consultant for a very big business house, and then he also took to public life, and he remained illustrious for the next 3 decades or so. Such developments are not too many in the Indian Foreign Service, primarily also because the Indian Foreign Service is a very restricted kind of a service, and it's all the secrets often don't come out. We don't get to hear about them often. We don't get to record them. But at least in one occasion, in the last 10 years, when we saw something similar happen, was when Sujata Singh, the Foreign Secretary in 2014, the circumstances in which Mrs. Sujata Singh had to leave the Foreign Service was controversial. In fact, it was also covered in a bit of secrecy, but then when she left, I understand the media got hold of some of the statements that she had made to her colleagues, and it was actually in January 2015 that she left the service, and the next foreign secretary was, of course, Mr. Jaishankar. And when she left, in a farewell event, she made certain remarks, and I think one of the journalists from the Outlook magazine got hold of those remarks, and those comments, so to say, went viral. So I think the career of Sujata Singh is somewhat comparable, especially the last few days of Sujata Singh's career is comparable to A.P. Venkateswaran's career, though they are not exactly similar.
Thank you so much for joining us today.